In their 2019 book, The Anthropology of the Future, Rebecca Bryant and David Knight write about vernacular timescapes, periods defined by epochal thinking in which people individually experience defined by epochal thinking in which people individually experience culturally defined temporal orientations appropriate to particular kinds of activity. These periods, as categories of experience, may be designated loosely in thematic terms. People go through times of war, times of healing, times of crisis, or times of prosperity. How would one characterize the vernacular timescape of contemporary Serbia? Almost 30 years has passed since the Yugoslav Wars started. The energies that sustained both nationalistic and anti-nationalistic fervor in Serbia seem largely to have lapsed. In comparison to 20 years ago, many Serbs profess a willingness to adopt a sharper mode of self-scrutiny. Looking back on what happened, some confess to frustration and shame. Others claim that they were and still are unjustly ostracized and stigmatized for everything that went wrong during the wars. But the overall feeling is that people seem more willing not only to reckon with, but to move beyond the past. They feel they have been stuck in its mire for too long. Calls for moving beyond the past, though, are not always made in a mood of high energy. A number of respondents to my ongoing Serbian fieldwork complain they're running on empty. For the last 10 years, I've heard continual lamentations about how the collective psychic energy of people in Serbia has been leached or washed away. My respondents feel exhausted not just on account of the wars or because of the conflict's economic or psychological consequences, but as a result of Serbia's current political and mental ecology. They describe the environment as impure, stagnant, and treacherous. They feel they're continuously hectored by their political and economic leaders, whom they describe as despotic and predatory. The government is accused of fostering, not just failing to relieve, conditions that affect all of society. Poverty is deeper than ever, the budget is in deficit, criminal networks are untouched, public administration is opaque and frequently incompetent, infrastructure is wrecked, the judiciary is corrupt, and all kinds of discriminations run riot. In the words of Dušica, a retired professional dancer and my longtime interlocutor, our lives have lacked balance for too long. We are neglected as a society. We live in a perpetual state of uncertainty, rudderless. People crave change, but no one believes in change anymore. All the time we exaggerate emotively about our past, criticize our present, and feel we have no future. Our futures have been already hijacked. Now, how do vernacular timescapes come into being? Political or economic constructions of hopelessness often go hand in hand with a mentality of self-defeat. Can timescapes only be measured by political and economic standards? What decides which sets of narratives will become most prominent in everyday consciousness when people try to explain their own but also collective experiences of time? If the past, a national past, is experienced as impaired and the present as deficient and humiliating, how does then one think about the future? What kind of futures seem inevitable? How do people living in these times of effort deal with what does not yet exist? Looking at the material I have collected over the past 18 years, the interviews and memories I've documented consist mainly of narratives of loss, fatigue, and hopelessness, similar to Dušica's. They're full of the people who apparently randomly let their contempt for the society they live in leak out as the subtext of the conversation in almost a stream of consciousness way. Complaint is, of course, a popular cultural form of communication in Serbia. But did I capture all of it? What about the other side of Serbia's imagined vernacular timescape, its underbelly? As well as hopelessness or despair in the absence of a future, are some people expressing hope? And if so, in what mode? What are their strategies for summoning the future, for mediating it, not in a technologically enhanced way, but through the implications of their actions and practice. How does one approach these alternative conceptions of the future anthropologically? This is the problematic of the paper. Now, the idea of visions and visionary is way too inchoate to lend itself straightforwardly to ethnographic examination. One usually calls people visionaries when they are historical figures. There is no kind of book phone of visionaries, although there are many listings, public listings of seers in Serbia. In order to bring some specificity to my key concept, I decided initially to identify visionary projects with projects concerning the common or societal good. Seeking to parlay a different, better future into being is nowadays often associated with the ethos and practices of social entrepreneurs. I chose, therefore, to focus on people who claim to be able to respond actively and innovatively to the notion that the time they live in requires an immediate, real and pragmatic restructuring of people's political, social and economic ways of living. My research was less concerned with social entrepreneurship in its legal or economic definition. Then it took that formula as a label for a different set of practices through which people project hope, not as a political project, but as a palpable set of actions through which they try to put forward an alternative to current conditions. I started then to look out for collaborators and respondents in the fields of urbanism, public health, education and migration. And since my concern was not just with economic reform, I also followed the work of various architects, planners, educators, cosmologists, biological archaeologists, and inventors. Other interlocutors involved included public intellectuals, traditional musicians, sport gurus, herbalists, painters. And my aim was to gauge which practices and whose are recognized as unusually resourceful, inspirational, oriented towards the common good, or capable of offering cognitive tools escaping the usual etiquettes of mainstream, countercultural, or alternative ways of thinking and acting. This presentation passes on some of my interlocutors' idea, hopefully giving some color and some context to what it means to think alternatively about time. I first learned about Ivan, a 43-year-old industrial archaeologist, through a newspaper story on the feats of a Belgradian collective interested in underground urban geography. What really got my attention was how he described his project to the journalist. Ivan is a hunched figure with a precise and somewhat public manner. He grew up as an only child, partly in Belgrade and partly in Moscow, and is a great connoisseur of modernist architecture. Serbian intellectual circles of the 19th and 20th centuries, augmented reality, and the literature of what he calls collective subconsciousness. In the last 15 years, he has encouraged and carried out a variety of ambitious short and long-term projects exploring the industrial heritage of Belgrade and other Serbian towns. Along with 4 other permanent and many other occasional members of the collective, Ivan explores the material and conceptual traces of both ancient and modern settlements, such as Second World War factories or airports. And through a series of different engagements, workshops, lectures, research projects, and sometimes even TV shows, the collective seeks to educate the public regarding certain lesser-known aspects of Serbian cities, aiming to preserve cultural and historical spaces. He understands his activities as a form of activism akin to social entrepreneurship. Since we met one August morning 3 years ago, I've spent a long time walking in and under the city and talking with him and other members of the collective about generational affiliation, habits, the legacy of the Roman Empire in the Balkans, the mindset of Serbian society, and time. He says, as a society, we are split in two, cut in half by the times we live. The media, the government, even some respected public intellectuals, all in their own way, keep projecting this idea to the people that we are standing at some virtual crossroad, where we have to decide whether to go back, to retrace the path of some imaginary past, or to go forward to a better future. But in reality, there is no such crossroad. We stand in one place. We are stuck in a very strange cocoon. Well, if I just observe what happened to most of my generation, I know so many people who were amazing figures 20, even 15 years ago. Despite the whole mess of the wars, they were extraordinarily creative individuals, full of grand ideas, with very concrete plans and realizing them. Yet, look at them now, most of them seem in deep anesthesia. They take deep dives all the time into some quiet nihilism, into self-deception, pragmatism, hangovers, anger. Serbia is definitely not an easy place to live in. Everybody's trying hard to survive financially. But the problem is that people keep amputating themselves, giving up their plans. Today no one would recognize my friends as top musicians or scientific geniuses, though they were once. And do you know why? Because in the meantime they have got frustrated, tired, adopted cynicism as their easiest, the default position for so much of the structure of their daily life and interactions. But in my opinion, cynicism is a barren attitude. You spit on everything, but examine nothing. This is why one must constantly move, act, work, create, trust, every day, consciously. This place must be protected, made clean, in a calm, loving way. Our views and ways of seeing need to be made clear, directed into purposeful creation. And a few months and conversations later, he says, this moral decay people talk so much about, I see it differently. It's true that society is rotting. Politics right now and the entertainment nomenclatura mean that there is a consumer mentality and trashy aesthetics in every area of life. But I'm sure that Serbia will survive this period of savagery. You know how much savagery it has overcome over the past 2 millennia. Look at these wonderful buildings. Look how eternal they are. Dirty, with streaks in their facades, but even the cracked ones are still beautiful. I always tell my friends, those who look at the buildings long enough will see the faces of the people who made them in them. Every building is a store of the imagination of their builders, their designers, or those who bequeathed them to us. Their beauties will last. Their current neglect cannot overshadow that. All these genius architects and wealthy industrialists who knew what architects trust, well, they knew how to look ahead. They paid attention to how aesthetically and conceptually harmonious Belgrade could be. People used to build buildings for eternity, not on commission. Now that is an elevated way of thinking and of understanding yourself. Buildings like those, parks like these, and all these urban structures, this will outlive us. Architecture is a very concrete connection between space and time. Look left and right down the street now. Just look and you will see time expanding, spilling over yards, streets, corridors. Exactly such fragments of time that we call Ottoman, Baroque, Art Deco, Socialist, Provincial, Urban, all these together provide the dynamics of the street. They are the basis of its dignity and harmony. They remind us of how the built environment can look like and how it can make us feel, especially today when only cheap nonsense is ever built. But I really believe that reasonable times will come again. The younger generations are fantastic. My students are amazing, intellectually agile, fast, capable, motivated, brave. They know how to turn to each other, to organize themselves, help each other immediately, translate ideas into concrete proposals. And they trust each other. I don't know, maybe one can trust oneself and others with such an open heart only when one is young. I don't know, but what I see is good. The other day, a student kept talking about how excited he was about Stanojević and Petrović. Those are two very important figures in Serbian history of the 19th and 20th century. They were theoretical physicians and mathematicians who wrote about celestial mathematics on a really, really high level. Can you imagine? Do you understand who the role models are? Visionaries. That's why it's redundant and so silly to roll eyes and moralize over that idea we live in awful present. No. We live in a time we share with some amazing ancestors and with future inventors and creators. New generations will come and build and think even more beautifully and harmoniously. We're just in a rough phase right now. So what we have to do is to gently take care of our ancestors and successors and carefully handle our time. To understand and relax into it, putting our energy into thinking clearly and understanding the different connections we have to the past and future. Time is on our side, and all we have to do is to trust it. Trust in a responsible way, so that in interim we can work and create things things in its favor. Branko, a designer of educational toys for children of migrants, has other thoughts about future. Our society became deeply stratified over the past 25 years. Some people of the same background and education as everyone else have serious money, while others can barely make ends meet. But not everything here is in coma. Whoever works to enrich this place, to start interesting projects, well, they're bound to leave traces. What people have to understand is that it is equally important to urge ideas as it is to push material things, to look for them, to source them, to renew them. I have an aunt who likes to repeat that American phrase, "It's not what you get, it's what you become." But I don't think this applies to Serbia. Here, what you get in terms of your own and society's legacy really counts, but it's also what you do with it. And even if everyone does remain as if they are in coma, our material culture would still have a lot to say to us. We have a rich history, a history that tells us people went through longer lasting adversity than we're going through now. End of quote. Now, there are a number of things one could point out at this juncture, and I'll just focus on a few. The social is often phrased and expressed in economic and political terms. Politics and economics are sometimes taken to comprise a form of meta-language in which people come ultimately to express their emotions about the time in which they live. But not everything is a matter of politics and economics. I spent time with women and men of different ages, different backgrounds and vocations. Many are way less articulate than the two men who have just spoken. Yet almost all were highly critical of the usual language for gauging public opinion and of its familiar contradictions in politics. In that sense, they were invested in wanting to change how national debates are framed on questions to do with people's health, education, and well-being. In one way or another, they stressed that through their work, they wished to recalibrate Serbia's language for discussing society and politics. They see their own projects, whether as radiologists or local herbalists, as vitally linked to processes of making others take a renewed interest in contemporary social, environmental and political issues. But they also want to catalyze people's processes of self-understanding. And some have called that process a corrective rewiring or broadening of the Serbian mind. I did, though, regularly press my interlocutors on how politically active they seek to be. Some saw their work as directly linked to politics. Ivan, for example, was an active figure in the Otpor movement, which was central to the overthrow of Milosevic's regime in 2000 and had spent considerable time in prison. Similarly, Branko was detained for a month for taking part in anti-government demonstrations only last April. Yet they talk about their actions as larger than politics. Others yet oppose the idea of overt political activism and do not identify their projects as calls for major change, arguing that these are sometimes utopian and rest on unrealistic projects. Their calls, most of the time, were not calls for revolution. Rather, they're calling for creation of kind of parallel system in both intellectual and practical space that will, at some point, acquire their own critical mass and momentum. Importantly, the concepts of precariousness, of bare existence, or of lack of opportunities that are so popular with the media do not seem to occupy much of the visionary's imagination and working vocabulary. It was actually really a surprise for me to realize that I was rarely speaking about the need for the country to square up to various issues such as historical injustices, systematic economic unfairness, or failures of the political order. Rather, they seemed interested in creating forms of material and psychological well-being from what they have at hand. Besides constantly tinkering with new devices, possibilities and timescales, they're also often passionately interested in traditional, local or old knowledge, trying to recreate, refashion and set off both conceptual and material cast-offs in fresh ways. My next point would be that these people tend to refer very distinctively to time. Ivan and Branko, for example, spoke enthusiastically of scholars, visionaries, but also of rich industrialists who, quote, put Belgrade in their debt by supporting architects to create elaborate, artistically refined buildings belonging to all eternity. Other respondents described how various founders endowed the poor or orphans with lasting schools and scholarships. Indeed, many draw inspiration for their activities from exemplary acts of bequeathing or endowing, and so caring for others, especially for the poor, a practice that is known in Serbia since the Middle Ages as zadužbinarstvo. Zadužbinarstvo denotes a voluntary practice of offering practical support to the community, with connotations not unlike the term charity, and it implies a dedication to good deeds in the form of establishing funds for long-term giving, sometimes entailing a transfer of inheritance and wealth, ensuring long-term support for the community. Now, this links to another important thing. Unlike the majority of my interlocutors in other research projects, who would usually frame their own and society's position with invocations of the golden 70s and 80s or terrible 90s and 2000s, these people were concerned with the longer past, making myriad references to Roman times, medieval times, and the Serbia of the 18th, 19th, and 20th century. And in my reading, this is not an act of kind of random tapping into imaginary pasts in order to create or to confect some voluntary lineage. It is more an act of stating, if this was done in the past, we can repeat it in the present and ennoble it. In that sense, their vision of the future, I think, is archaeological, disinterred from within the possibilities of our moment and its many pasts. Building up or moving forward actually means digging down. One of Ivan Rajkovic's conclusion, so not even that I just quoted here, but an anthropologist, in 2017, in an excellent article describing the demoralization of Serbian factory workers, is that anthropologists are too ready to romanticize an idea of the inner freedom of discarded workers rather than engaging in an analysis of the socio-political conditions which has seen them cast aside. I absolutely agree. Of course, we should beware of praising ethnographic micro-freedoms or studying only the micro-worlds in which systemic victims or losers are free to express a local resistance to power. Yet, my ethnographic experiences of the last 4 years suggest that it can be equally willful, actually equally a sop to academic populism, to be nothing but ironic about people's orientations to the future and to their expressions of hope. Many in Serbia remain possessed by the war, a typical motive of academic literature and popular culture. But equally some, as I have seen, are going to great lengths at trying to co-create people's collective understanding of the present, their sense of the vernacular timescape. I would want to stand up for a broad conception of what these people are doing as healing and empowering. And this case can be made with references to specific projects, for example, a classroom of refugees' children or a network of underground tunnels that all these people are doing. Yet these visionaries and entrepreneurs' more influential work may be, I think, conceptual. Listen to how Anna, a professional performer of sacred music and mover behind health system reforms, thinks of time. Serbia must be cleansed of its build-up of negative ideas, its residue of negative thoughts. And deep cleansing is, amongst other things, effected by performing and listening to spiritual music. People have to pay attention to how their thoughts are good and their acts beneficial, useful and responsible. We may not be able to see the future, but we can examine the past, many pasts. Anyway, the Serbian patriarch, Pavle, used to say that time is only a duration, something with a past, present, and a future. Now, people can naturally get tired with all that duration. So the right thing to do is to step out of it once in a while, to be able to look forwards and backwards, not just to see problems, but all kinds of resources at hand. And we have some great resources and a resilient young population. What we need is a more supportive environment in which people could grow outwards from within. Now, something that might appear conceptual, such as performing and listening to traditional sacred music, is actually in her eyes, as well in the eyes of many of her followers, understood as a material intervention into Serbia's physical but also psychic environment. Although Ivan would never subscribe to the idea that sacred, even from the ethnography, would never subscribe to the idea that sacred music could be mentally cleansing like Anna, he understands his own urban activism as a form of societal healing. His promotion of the internal harmony, symbolism, spatial history, involves making tours of Belgrade's underground and protecting its forgotten cultural and social monuments. And he keeps explaining he wants to life or nourish the poverty of imagination afflicting his countrymen, so that they can see buildings and streets not as debris, but as the living relics of different times, Baroque, Ottoman, socialist. And this would grant the city and its inhabitants a special dynamic, weight and dignity, in his words. In that way, caring for the urban heritage, that is, its material body, is at the service of fighting conceptual poverty and tends, as it were, to its spiritual body. The manifestations of this mode of care for others are both material and conceptual. They aim to change both people's circumstances and their ways of thinking. And just to conclude, most people I talk to see Serbia as tottering on weak economic and ethical foundations. Serbs' daily concern is to survive, not to go ahead, not to get ahead. It is oppressive to people that they have to fight so hard just to stay alive. As they say, it ties them to the past, and the past is something they really dislike. A sense of perspective, though, motivates certain individuals to change and seek a better future. Now, starting from that position, the whole logic of my study in the beginning was to get away from ideas that Serbia could only be understood historically. That, for example, inescapably, the most persuasive analogy for situations in contemporary Serbia were ones from its conflict-ridden past. So I intentionally turned my attention to images illustrating the precariousness of the present and to those anticipating what may come next as projected by entrepreneurial visionaries. I was initially interested with the future, not with the past. But of course, the future lies at one end of a trajectory. For my informants, admittedly not a large subsection of Serbs, responsible trust in the future often means a responsible attitude towards the past. They argue that a genuine restructuring of people's social, economic and political modes of life is needed, yet they refuse to think Serbia beyond cure and irretrievably corrupt. They do not understand future-oriented thinking merely as a kind of rational act or a cognitive experiment based on intentions. Rather, they see it as a process that resumes notions of intergenerational care, trust, responsibility, resourcing, and different ways of time scripting. And there are ways, they argue, to step out of duration that are shared, to see beyond current exhaustion, and tap into longer historical perspectives, or even warp them. In that way, I argue my interlocutors' visions, in the specific contexts I described, may be read as a form of time standing out against the cultural script of presentism, in which time is read as a precarious, threatening, and unhopeful category. Now, the present analysis hopes to encourage a slightly different view of Serbia, to supplement an image of Serbia as only a depleted space, a space where everyone is exhausted, which has no alternative possible futures. Yet the Serbia I've seen in this research is economically starved. The Serbia I've seen in this research is economically starved, spiritually wounded, and historically overwhelmed in different ways. But it is also ready, to an extent, to be reshaped by alternative conceptions of what it could become. If we postulate that we can imagine the future only from a present vantage, my material shows that visionary futures are sometimes conceived from the point of view of a selected past. I've even had conversations about how the future may influence the past, but that is for another paper. Thank you so much.